My name is Vexthal Oran. For 11 cycles I have studied human soldiers. It has been my only work. I have watched more recordings of human battles than any other member of my kind. I know how fast a human pilot reacts to danger. I know how long a human body can survive under stress before it breaks down. I know, on average, the exact moment when a human unit decides to run instead of fight. I built my whole career on these numbers. I thought I understood humans completely. I was wrong. I want to say that clearly before I explain what happened. For most of this war, humans behaved exactly the way my models said they would. They were brave, braver than almost any species we had studied before them. They were stubborn, sometimes in ways that cost them their own lives, when a calm retreat would have saved them. They were also clever. More than once, their strange, sudden ideas in battle cost us entire fleets before we learned to expect the unexpected from them. But under all of that, I still believed they were soldiers. Just soldiers. They followed orders. They obeyed their commanders. They counted their odds, even when the numbers were bad, and when the numbers turned hopeless, they eventually stopped fighting, the same way every other species we have ever fought has eventually stopped fighting. I placed humanity in a simple category in my reports. Expensive but solvable. My superiors trusted this judgment. They built their final plans around it. Before I speak about the final battle, I think it is worth explaining how I came to study humans in the first place, because it helps explain why what happened later surprised me so deeply. I did not choose humans as my subject. I was assigned to them, early in my career, when the Dominion first made contact with Earth and needed analysts to understand this new species quickly. At the time, most of my colleagues considered the assignment a small one. Humans were young compared to many species in the galaxy. Their technology was behind ours in several important ways. Our early reports predicted a short, simple conflict. Those early reports were wrong almost immediately. In our first major engagement with human forces, we lost far more ships than expected, not because their weapons were stronger, but because their commanders made choices our models did not predict. They took risks that looked foolish on paper, and somehow turned those risks into victories. After that first surprise, my superiors decided humans deserved closer study, and I was given the task of leading that study. For the first few cycles, I approached the work the same way I approached every other species before them. I collected data, I built models. I looked for patterns in how they fought, how they organized their forces, how they responded to loss. Slowly, those models became accurate. I learned to predict human battle tactics with growing success. I began to feel, cycle after cycle, that I finally understood them the way I understood any other opponent the Dominion had faced. I want to admit something here that I have never written in an official report. During those years of study, I found myself, more than once, quietly admiring the humans I was supposed to be studying only as a threat. Their history, which I read carefully as part of my research, was full of conflict among themselves, long before we ever arrived. And yet, again and again, I found records of humans setting aside old disagreements to help each other during disasters that had nothing to do with war. I told myself this was simply useful information, helpful for predicting behavior. I did not yet understand that it was, perhaps, the most important information I would ever gather about them. That plan led us to a place called Callus Reach. Callus Reach is not a beautiful system. It has one dead star that gives off almost no light. It has one moon, stripped bare long ago by some old war that not even our oldest records remember. There is nothing valuable there, no metals worth mining, no fuel worth collecting. Nothing except one long, narrow path through space that ships can use to enter or leave the system. We held both ends of that path. When the last human battle group, known as the Meridian Group, fled there after losing their outer colonies, we did not rush in after them. We did not need to hurry. They were already trapped. The only question left was when we would finish the job. I remember the feeling I had at that time. It was not excitement, it was something quieter, something closer to satisfaction. I believed I would finally get to close this long file and move on to a new assignment. Humanity's story, from my point of view, was about to end exactly the way I had predicted it would. The battle began the way I expected it to begin. Our first group of ships broke through their outer defenses in under 6 minutes, which was faster than even our best models had guessed. Their ships had grown old and tired after years of constant war. Their defense systems could no longer keep up with the speed of our attack. One by one, their outer ships went dark on our screens. I watched all of this from a safe distance, the way I always did, studying the numbers as they changed. Vectors shifting, probabilities collapsing toward the outcome we had already written in our reports weeks earlier. For 30 minutes, everything matched the plan almost perfectly. Then, at the 31-minute mark, something changed. And that change is the reason I am writing this account now, instead of simply filing my usual report and moving on. I want to explain carefully what I mean, because it matters more than anything else I have written in 11 cycles of work. The humans did not become careless. They did not fall apart in panic, which is what my models expected to happen at this stage of heavy losses. Panic would have made them easy to finish off, scattering in different directions, dying one at a time in confusion. That is not what happened. Instead, every remaining ship in the Meridian group began moving together, with a kind of coordination I had never once recorded from human forces before. Not even during their best-planned battles earlier in the war. It looked as if 30 minutes of dying had burned away everything extra, leaving only the one true purpose underneath. I searched the sensor recordings again and again afterward, trying to find the exact command that caused this shift. There was no such command. No lead ship broadcast new instructions to the others. No automated system took control of their formation. As far as I have been able to determine, using every tool available to Dominion intelligence, no single human gave an order that explains what happened next. They simply understood, all together, in the same instant, what needed to be done. Here is what they did. Their surviving warships stopped protecting themselves. They turned instead to protect something we had barely paid attention to during the battle planning, because our models told us it did not matter to the outcome. 6 unarmed transport ships had been traveling with the Meridian fleet. Our analysts had marked them as low-priority targets, since destroying transports would not change who won or lost the battle. We were wrong about that too, in a way I did not expect. Those 6 ships were carrying several thousand human civilians who had been evacuated earlier from the colonies. Among them were children, elderly people who could no longer fight, wounded soldiers being carried away from earlier battles. None of them had any effect on the military outcome of what was happening at Callus Reach. By every rule I had ever written about human behavior in combat, protecting those transports was the wrong choice. It would only make the warships die faster, since they would now be splitting their attention and their remaining strength between fighting us and shielding ships that could not fight back. It could not change who won the battle. We already controlled both ends of the only path out of the system, and the humans knew this. Their own recorded communications, which we recovered after the battle ended, show clearly that every crew understood, ship by ship, that this choice meant none of the fighters would survive. They chose it anyway, every single remaining ship, at almost the exact same moment, as if they had somehow agreed on it without speaking a word to each other. I have studied thousands of final battles fought by many different species across many wars. Most final battles are fought to deny the enemy something important, a resource, a piece of land, information that must not fall into enemy hands. This was different. There was nothing left at Callus Reach for us to take that we had not already taken. The only thing the Meridian Group's final choice achieved was buying those 6 transport ships extra time, roughly 40 minutes, to reach the far end of the narrow path, where a jump point could carry them somewhere we could not immediately follow. 40 minutes. That is what it cost them to purchase. 41 warships, every person serving aboard those ships, all of it, spent on 40 minutes for strangers they had likely never met. I watched their flagship, a ship called the Ashen Vow, take heavy damage and continue fighting anyway. It did not turn away, it did not try to escape. It held its position directly between our forward line and the transports until the very last moment its systems could still function. Its captain's final message was not a call for help, it was not a surrender. It was not even addressed to the other Dominion ships or to human command. Our systems intercepted it being sent on an open civilian channel, meant only for the people aboard those transport ships. 3 words, repeated over and over, until the signal finally went silent. We have you. That moment is when I stopped being able to write my report the way I had written every report before it. For 11 cycles, I had placed humans into one simple category: soldiers. Skilled, expensive to fight, but limited, and in the end, finite, like every other species we had faced. Soldiers fight to win. If winning is no longer possible, they fight to survive. If survival is no longer possible, they fight to make the enemy pay a price worth remembering. What I watched at Callus Reach did not match any of those patterns. There was no possible win left on the table for them. There was no personal survival being bought, since every crew aboard those warships knew they themselves would not live to see the jump point close behind the transports. And the price they made us pay was, honestly, not even severe by Dominion standards. We lost 12 ships. They lost 41. They were not calculating the best possible result and choosing it, the way careful commanders usually do. I do not believe they were calculating anything at all in that final moment. I believe every crew member on every one of those 41 ships looked at 6 unarmed transports full of strangers, people they would likely never meet, and decided, without needing a single word of discussion, that this was simply what they existed to do. My superiors want this event recorded only as a military engagement. Callus Reach, Dominion victory, 41 enemy ships destroyed, objective secured. I have filed my official report that way, because that is my job, and because the numbers themselves are accurate. But I want it written somewhere else, outside that official record, that I no longer believe the word soldier is enough to describe what I watched die that day. A soldier is a shape a living being takes on when it needs to fight. What I saw during the last 40 minutes of the Meridian group was not a shape they took on for the sake of the war. It was something that had always been underneath that shape, something the soldier had been built and trained to protect, finally acting on its own, with nothing left to give but everything it still had. After the battle ended, I stayed behind with the recovery teams longer than my duties required. This was not normal for me. Analysts are meant to gather data and leave. But I found myself walking through the wreckage field near the moon, watching our own crews collect what remained. Most of it was simple debris, broken hull plates, burned wiring, the quiet remains of machines that no longer worked. But among the wreckage, our teams also found something I had not expected: a small data core, still active, drifting free from one of the smaller human escort ships. It had survived the battle by pure chance, protected inside a thick shielded case meant to carry the ship's final logs. I requested permission to review it myself instead of passing it to a junior officer. My commanders were surprised by the request, but they allowed it, mostly because none of them wanted to spend the time on it themselves. Inside the data core, I found something simple. Personal messages, not military orders, not tactical plans. Just short recordings that the crew of that small ship had made to their families, meant to be sent home if they survived, and kept safe if they did not. I listened to every one of them, though I did not need to for my report. None of them spoke about victory. None of them spoke about the enemy at all. They spoke about ordinary things: a promise to visit an old friend when the war ended, a joke about a meal someone missed eating back home, a short message from a young officer to a sibling, asking them to look after a pet if anything happened to her. There was nothing in those recordings that suggested any of them expected to become part of something larger than themselves. They were simply people, doing their duty, hoping to return to small, ordinary lives. And yet, when the moment came, every one of them chose the same thing the rest of the fleet chose. I found this difficult to explain using anything I had learned in 11 cycles of study. I brought this finding to my superiors, expecting it to be filed away and forgotten, as most personal recordings are during wartime. Instead, one of my senior commanders, an older officer named Dras Kethiel, asked to see it himself. Dras had fought against humans since the earliest days of the war, longer than almost anyone else still serving. He listened to the recordings in silence, without comment, for a long time. When he finally spoke, he did not talk about strategy or numbers. He said something I have thought about many times since. He said that in all his cycles of fighting, he had faced many species who fought bravely for their homes, their leaders, or their beliefs. But he had never faced a species that fought this way for strangers, who had done nothing for them personally. He said it troubled him, not because it made humans dangerous in the way we usually measure danger, but because it meant we had been asking the wrong question about them from the very beginning. We had spent years asking how hard humans would fight to win. We had never properly asked how far they would go for each other, even when winning was already impossible. I have thought about that question every day since. A short time later, I learned that one of the 6 transport ships had suffered damage during its escape, and had been forced to stop at a small neutral station on the far side of the jump point. Dominion Command sent a small diplomatic team to that station, mostly to gather information, and I asked to join them. My request was approved, again mostly because no one else wanted the assignment. At the station, I was permitted to speak briefly with a few of the human survivors who had been aboard that transport. I expected the conversation to be difficult, and in some ways it was, but I also learned things I could not have learned from any sensor recording. One older man, who had been responsible for a group of children during the escape, told me plainly that he did not consider himself brave. He said the warships had done the brave thing. He said his only job had been to keep the children calm during the 40 minutes it took to reach the jump point, and that he had done that job by telling them stories, the same way he might have done on any ordinary day before the war began. I asked him if he understood why the warships had chosen to stay behind and protect the transports, instead of trying to save themselves. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said he did not think it was a difficult choice for them at all. He said that where he came from, people who could help were expected to help, and that the size of the danger did not change that expectation. He said it as simply as if he were explaining a basic fact of nature, not a decision that had cost 41 ships and everyone aboard them. I did not know how to respond to that at the time. I still am not certain I know how to respond to it now. Before I left the station, I was allowed to view a short list of names, recovered from the Ashen Vow's final transmission, of the crew members who had sent that last message. I read through the list slowly. They were ordinary names, the kind that appear thousands of times across human records. I do not know why I felt it was important to read them, since names alone tell an analyst nothing useful about tactics or strategy. But I read every one of them anyway, and I have not forgotten that list since. In the weeks after Callus Reach, Dominion Command asked me to prepare a new set of recommendations for future battles against remaining human forces. They wanted updated numbers, new models, a revised version of the same kind of report I had written for 11 cycles. I sat with that request for a long time before I began writing it. What I eventually gave them was shorter than anything I had written before. I told them that it was no longer possible to build reliable battle plans around the assumption that humans would act to protect themselves. Every earlier model we used, including my own, depended on that assumption somewhere at its core. Every species we had studied, including our own, eventually reaches a point where self-preservation takes priority over any other goal. Humans, it seemed, did not follow that same pattern once enough of their own people, especially the ones they saw as needing protection, were placed at risk. There was no clear floor to what they would give up, no simple number I could put into a report that would tell my commanders when humans would finally stop. I recommended, instead of a new battle plan, that the Dominion seek a way to end the war entirely, rather than fight it to its natural conclusion. I did not expect this recommendation to be accepted, and it mostly has not been. War moves slowly toward peace, even when peace is clearly the wiser choice. But I wanted it said clearly, by someone who was present at Callus Reach, that continuing this war exactly as before was no longer a simple military decision. It was something else now, something none of our old models were built to handle. Some cycles have passed since that battle. The war has not ended, though it has slowed in ways that even our command has noticed. Fewer large battles are fought now. More small negotiations happen quietly between officers on both sides, away from the attention of higher command. I do not know if this change is connected to what happened at Callus Reach, but I suspect it is, at least in part. Word of that battle spread, even among species allied with the Dominion who had never fought humans directly. Many of them asked to see the recordings for themselves. Many of them, like Dross, grew quiet after watching. I still work as an analyst. That has not changed. But my work has changed in ways I did not expect. I no longer write reports that treat humans as a simple military problem to be solved with better numbers. I have begun keeping a second set of notes, separate from my official work, where I try to understand not how humans fight, but why they choose to fight the way they do. It is slower work. It does not fit neatly into charts or probability curves. Some of my colleagues think it is a waste of time, but I believe it may be the only way to truly understand what we faced at Callus Reach, and what we may still face if this war continues. I sometimes think back to the message from the Ashen Vow. We have you. 3 simple words, sent to strangers on ships that had no way to fight back, by a crew who knew they themselves would not survive the next few minutes. It was not meant to threaten us or warn us. It was meant only for the people it was protecting, to let them know, in their final moments together, that they were not alone. I keep a copy of that message in my personal files, separate from anything official. I am not entirely sure why. Perhaps it is simply a reminder that after 11 cycles of studying humans as numbers on a screen, I finally saw something I had missed the entire time. They were never only soldiers. Soldiers were simply the shape they wore when the war required it of them. Underneath that shape was something steadier, something that did not disappear even when every reason to keep fighting was gone. I do not know how this war will end. I do not know if the Dominion will ever fully understand what we are truly facing when we face humanity. But I know now that any plan built only around defeating human soldiers will always be missing something important. Because in the end, at Callus Reach, it was not their soldiers who won that battle for them, not in the way victories are usually counted. It was something quieter than that, something that showed itself only once everything else had already been lost. I have decided to keep writing these notes, even though no one has asked me to. I do this because I believe someone, someday, will need to understand what I saw that day at Callus Reach, not the numbers, Not the ship counts or the casualty reports. The 3 words sent to strangers, and the choice made by 41 crews who had nothing left to gain, and gave everything anyway. That is the part of the story the official records will never fully capture, and it is the part I believe matters most. Sometimes, when my current work grows quiet, I return to that list of names from the Ashen Vow. I do not read it because I am required to. I read it because it reminds me that behind every number in every report I have ever written, there was a person who made a choice, often in the space of a single breath, that no model could have predicted in advance. For 11 cycles, I believed my job was to explain how humans fought. I understand now that the more important question was always why, and that some answers cannot be reduced to numbers at all. If this war ends someday, whether in victory, defeat, or something quieter than either, I hope the story of Callus Reach is remembered clearly. Not simply as a battle where the Dominion gained 12 fewer ships than it lost, but as the moment when I, and many others who studied this war closely, finally understood what we had truly been fighting. I do not think we ever understood it fully. I am not certain any outside observer ever could. But I believe we came close enough that day to change the way this war is fought from now on, and perhaps, in some small way, to change how it will eventually end. For my part, I intend to keep listening, keep watching, and keep writing these quiet notes, long after my official reports are filed and forgotten. Some stories are worth remembering even when no one requires you to remember them. I believe this is one of those stories.